Howdy, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bean on the Scene. And I am Alma Bean, and let's get right to it. If you have watched any other episodes of Bean on the Scene, you will know that normally we start this off with the transfer portal, but nothing happened. So we're actually going to talk about some bigger news in college football today, which was the Big 12 schedule release. So right off rip, we're going to talk about BYU. Their schedule goes as follows. On August 30th, they will be at home versus Portland State. Then September 6th, they will be at home against Stanford. Then they'll have their bye week, and then they'll be back in action on September 20th at East Carolina. And then they will go into their first conference game, which will be on September 27th at Colorado. Then October 3rd versus West Virginia. October 11th at Arizona. Then October 18th, which will be their homecoming game at home against Utah. So reviving the Holy War once again. Then October 25th at Iowa State. Then they will get their next bye week. And then they'll be back in action on November 8th at Texas Tech. November 15th at home versus TCU. November 22nd at Cincinnati. And then wrapping up their season on November 29th versus UCF. Now, looking at those games, it seems like it's a easier schedule than this previous season for BYU, but I'm just going to throw out a way too early prediction for this one. I think they're going to finish the season 10-2. And their conference record will follow at 7-2. So I think that will put them near the top of their conference, but we'll see how things play out. Now for Utah, their schedule goes on August 30th at UCLA. Tough opening for them, but then they will go and face Cal Poly at home on September 6th. Then September 13th at Wyoming. September 20th at home versus Texas Tech. And September 27th on the road versus West Virginia. Then they will get their first bye week. And they'll be back in action on October 11th at home versus Arizona State. A little bit of a revenge game there, if you ask me. Then, as I stated earlier, October 18th, they will be on the road against BYU for the Holy War. October 25th at home versus Colorado. November 1st versus Cincinnati at home. Then they get their second bye week. Then they'll be back on November 15th at Baylor. Then November 22nd at home versus Kansas State. And then their final game has a flex date on it, either November 28th or 29th on the road at Kansas. I think that this year it'll hopefully be better for Utah. I mean, nothing went their way last season after finishing the year 5-7. But if things go in their direction, everybody buys into their new offensive coordinator, Jason Beck. I think that Utah has the ability to finish the season 9-3 with the same conference record as BYU at 7-2. With my hope being that the conference championship will be between Utah and BYU, and may the best man win in that case. So, as I stated, it was the Big 12 schedule release, which means that not everyone else's schedules have come out. So with Utah State, they haven't released their full schedule yet, but what we do know is how they will start. Utah State will open up their season at home against UTEP on August 30th. And then on September 6th, they will be on the road against Texas A&M. That one will be very difficult for them. But then they will get their bye week and then come back home on September 20th to face McNeese, and then wrap up their non-conference play on September 27th on the road against Vanderbilt. I think that they'll probably come out of that 2-2. It's just going to be two really hard road games for them. But as far as their conference play, we know who their opponents will be, but we just don't know their dates. So as far as Utah State's road games, they will have Fresno State, Hawaii, New Mexico, and UNLV. And then their home games will be against Air Force, Boise State, Nevada, and San Jose State. So my early prediction for them is that they are going to go 6-6 with a 4-4 conference record. It doesn't sound like too much, but based off of how they played last season, this is definitely a move in the right direction for them, given how many players they've lost in this offseason. But Again, I think that a 500 record is more than successful for them given how they performed this previous season. Now, for college basketball, BYU, their men's team, they had themselves a very eventful week as they took on Baylor at home and then UCF on the road. Their game against Baylor felt like a top 25 matchup, not to mention they had a guy like Conor McGregor in the stands leading chants for the student section, which I'm still mind blown that he even showed up in the state of Utah, but here we are. Now for the game, we saw a lot of great performances, especially VJ Edgecombe. He was looking like a top five pick with 28 points, 4 rebounds, and 5 assists on 9 of 15 shooting, with 6 of 8 of that being from the perimeter, along with Robert Wright III, who had 22 points, 4 rebounds, and 6 assists while shooting 6 for 12 from the field and 2 for 4 from the perimeter. So if you're looking at stats alone, it gets even crazier knowing that Baylor came to Provo with only 7 players that got minutes, with one of them being Jason Asamoah, who only got 6 minutes and only put on the stat sheet a turnover and 2 fouls. So really, Baylor played with 6 players for this entire game. But for BYU, they had a much larger roster to work with, having their usual starters show out with Richie Saunders getting 17 points, 6 rebounds, and 2 assists. Yegor Demon getting 15 points, 2 rebounds, 6 assists, and Trevin Nell with 11 points, 3 rebounds, and 1 assist. But the player who caught the country by storm was freshman Cannon Catchings. Catching shot lights out with a perfect 8 for 8 from the field and 4 for 4 from the perimeter. Given Catching's background with his family, he comes from a long line of basketball players, with his grandfather Harvey having 11 years in the NBA, Tamika, who is his aunt, uh, 4-time gold medalist, WNBA MVP, and Hall of Famer, and then Taja, his mother, who played at Illinois and then had a professional career overseas. We should have been able to see this one coming from Cannon. But this game, it was neck and neck throughout the entirety of its game. So much that this game had to go into overtime. Though it was a back and forth race, this game was a battle of free throws in overtime, which BYU ended up winning in overtime, getting the 93-89 win. UCF was no different. These teams were trading buckets back and forth, with UCF relying on Keyshawn Hall with 20 points, 8 rebounds, and 3 assists, and Mustafa Thaim with 17 points, 6 rebounds, and 1 assist to stay in this one. But a great showing from Richie Saunders with 22 points, and Mawat Mogg with 19 points, 3 rebounds, and 5 assists propelled BYU to an 81-75 win. Now, as far as their upcoming games, they have one tonight, Tuesday, February 4th, against 20th ranked Arizona. According to Joe Lenardi's bracketology, they are currently a number 5 seed. So this will definitely be a prove it game for BYU on whether or not they can hang with the teams that are in Joe Lenardi's bracketology in the March Madness. Now, their next game that they have is also this week, which will be on Saturday, February 8th at Cincinnati, which should be a gimme for BYU given how their recent play has been. But with college basketball, everyone is ready for an upset. Now, for BYU's women's team, they started off the week with a heartbreaker to Colorado, even though they had an amazing performance from Delaney Gibb with 19.7 rebounds and 3 assists. Being outscored in the second quarter 23-14 proved to be an uphill battle for BYU that they could not overcome, as they lost by 1 point, 67-66. Now, their other game that they had this week, they were going up against Arizona State. BYU was looking to end their, at the time, 5-game losing streak. And the third quarter ended up being their driving force as they outscored ASU 24-16. And they never looked back, as Emma Calvert, with 22 points, 4 rebounds, and 5 assists, and the Cougars got the 77-67 win. Now, as far as their upcoming games, BYU, they have their next game tomorrow, Wednesday, February 5th, against UCF at home. I think that the competition of play for UCF is similar to Arizona State. So if BYU can bring that same level of play to UCF, I think that they should come away with the win on that one. And then they have a second game this week on Saturday, February 8th at Baylor, which I believe should be a very difficult game for BYU, since Baylor is third in the conference with an 18-5 record and an 8-2 conference record. If BYU comes away with the win in that one, you'll know that Baylor is having an off night or BYU is just shooting lights out. But I do expect this one to be a tough matchup for BYU. Now, for the Utah men's team, Utah had two, in my opinion, must-win games this past week if they wanted to stay in the race for March. And first off, they had Cincinnati. I felt as if these teams were pretty evenly matched going into this one, and the final score proved to be that, with Gabe Matson getting 18 points, 2 rebounds, and 4 assists to put the Utes on his back, getting the narrow 69-66 win over the Bearcats. After that, they were off to Stillwater to take on Oklahoma State, where Utah felt like they were playing from behind the entirety of this game, with Oklahoma State starting off the game on a 9-1 run with all 4 buckets coming from different players. Even with a 39-point second half from Utah, they ended up leaving Stillwater with a disappointing 81-72 loss. Their upcoming games start tomorrow on Wednesday, February 5th at home versus Colorado. This one should be a good pick-me-up game because Colorado has yet to win any conference games, as they are currently 0-10. Hopefully Utah can do what's best for them and make that 0-11. And then they have another game this week on Saturday, February 8th at West Virginia, which I think should be an even competition for Utah. So you'll just really have to play this one out and see if they can get that narrow victory against their conference foe. Now, for the Utah women's team, they're now finding their groove after winning back-to-back games. They had to take on a very difficult Arizona team, with Gianna Neepkins balling out as usual with 28 points, 7 rebounds, and 3 assists. Utah was able to feel like they were the favorites in every game, especially if she's balling like that. They have to feel that way. And Utah was able to coast through this game as they got the 67-58 win over Arizona. That was the only game that they had this last week, but they have 2 this week, with the first one being tomorrow on Wednesday, February 5th at Texas Tech, which this one should be an easy win for Utah, but college basketball, no game is an easy win. But then also on Saturday, they have their game on February 8th at home versus UCF, which they are at the bottom of the conference. So these should be 2 easy wins for Utah to win to boost them up in the standings for Joe Lunardi's bracketology, which as of right now, Utah, they are making a pretty good case for themselves as they have a number 7 seed in that current bracketology. Now, for Utah State men's, it seems like they're fighting for their lives every single game, especially this past week, as they took on UNLV and New Mexico. First, with UNLV and USU, they looked like they were struggling in this one. Just even though they maintained the lead for the entirety of the game, UNLV had a 47-point second half to make this one interesting. But Drake Allen getting 15 points off of 5 of 7 shooting, with 3 of 3 being from the perimeter. And USU came away with the 76-71 win. Now, honestly, this game is probably the biggest one, the next one, biggest game for Utah State this season, as they were taking on the number 1 Mountain West ranked team, New Mexico. The first half, it looked like it belonged to Utah State, going into the locker room with a 36-30 point victory in that first half, but New Mexico leaned heavily on Nelly Jr. Joseph and Mustafa Amzil to take command in the second half, with the Lobos scoring 52 points in that second half to get a convincing 82-63 win over the Aggies. Even with that loss, like the NCAA tournament, we'll see if that loss will really have a large effect on the Aggies. But it is a pretty big hit for a conference that doesn't receive a lot of love from the committee. So as long as Utah State wins out, I don't think it will have that big of an impact, but something that may have a larger impact than expected. But as far as their upcoming games, they do have one later tonight on February 4th, this Tuesday at Wyoming, which can be heard on the KSL Sports Zone on 1280 a.m. with Scotty G starting at 6 p.m. Mountain Time with the pregame, with tip-off being at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And then they have a game on Friday, February 7th against Fresno State. Both of them should be easy wins for Utah State, unless that New Mexico loss really got into their heads. But I do anticipate Utah State to walk away with wins from both of those contests. Now, for the Utah State women's team, I'm not going to spend much time on it. They lost by double digits to Air Force 78-66. That should be enough said. Their next couple of games they have are tomorrow, Wednesday, February 5th versus UNLV at home. And then on Saturday, February 8th versus Fresno State. Even though those games are at home, they are not games that I am confident in just because of how the Lady Aggies have played. So hopefully they'll get the wins. But again, I'm not too confident on it based off of their most recent play. And last week, I brought the Utah Valley Wolverines onto the episode because of their amazing streak that they were on, but they got put back in their place by Grand Canyon, who beat them 75-57. Even though they are still in the run for the WAC tournament, this probably ruined the majority of their hope that UVU would have getting into the NCAA tournament. But if they win out the rest of the season, it'll make that WAC tournament a little more interesting. But again, that loss is a huge blow for the Wolverines. Now that we've gotten collegiate stuff out of the way, let's go to some of our professional sports with the Utah Jazz. Um, for the games that they played over the last week, we started off on the second night of a back-to-back on the road against Golden State on Tuesday. They did not have Steph Curry, but with him being gone, you would think that it would make the game a little bit easier for Utah, but you would be wrong. You still had some solid performances, though, from Colin Sexton, who had 30 points, 2 rebounds, and 4 assists, and Isaiah Collier, who had 12 points, 6 rebounds, and 9 assists. But each Dennis Schroeder and Brandon Podziemski dropped 20-plus points, which led to the Golden State win 114-103 over Utah. Then, after that one-game quick road trip, Utah came back to take on the Minnesota Timberwolves, where things definitely got out of hand. Keontae George dropped 23 points, 1 rebound, and 3 assists off the bench while shooting a perfect 7 for 7 from the field. Even with the return of John Collins, Lowry Markkanen, and Walker Kessler, Anthony Edwards didn't care about the reunion, and he dropped 36 points, 6 rebounds, and 11 assists. Even with the blowout in full swing in favor of Minnesota, Utah fans were able to receive them a treat for themselves as Joe Ingles was back in the building and the crowd roared, chanting for him to get some minutes in this game, which they did oblige and got him 4 minutes on the court. Unfortunately, it didn't lead to any shot attempts, but the arena was happy to see Slow Mo Joe back in action, and I was one of those people in the arena. It was fantastic. But now that you have the large loss that Utah had to the Minnesota Timberwolves, it was just awful. I mean, I was sitting there going, how long is this going to take? When can we wave the white flag? I just need this to be over. But, Minnesota ended up getting the 138-113 win. But they couldn't let that dwindle over them as they had the Orlando Magic up next. They don't have a great track record on the road, so this one seemed as if maybe Utah could get a win on this route, but they held Paolo Banchero to an abysmal 4 of 19 from the field, 0 of 6 from the perimeter to finish with 9.6 rebounds and 6 assists, which meant that Franz Wagner had to do everything in his power to keep Orlando in this game, and he did so by setting a career high in free throw attempts with 20. And he was even just 1 point shy of his career high, which is 38 points. He had 37 against the Utah Jazz. Even with that effort, Utah was able to end an 8-game losing streak, beating Orlando 113-99. Now, the final game that they had over the last week was against the Indiana Pacers. They didn't have Miles Turner, so I was anticipating Utah to crush it on the boards, which they did. They out-rebounded Indiana 60-37, with 17 of those 60 rebounds being offensive. John Collins and Walker Kessler each had double-digit rebounds, and even Keontae George and Isaiah Collier got in on the double-digit action as they had double-digit assists, which made them the youngest duo in NBA history to have a double-double with assists in the same game. And if we're going to talk about statistics, um, Deontay George was 2 rebounds shy of getting a triple-double, which our last one that Utah had was on New Year's Day with Jordan Clarkson. Um, the game came down to the final play after some clutch shooting from George, but Utah ended up getting a thrilling loss, 112 to 111. Now, for their upcoming games, they have one tomorrow on Wednesday, February 5th at home versus Golden State. And then they will go on the road starting Friday, February 7th at Phoenix. Then the second night of a back to back for Saturday, February 8th at the Los Angeles Clippers. And then Monday, February 10th at the Lakers. Um, there were a handful of trade alerts, and that Lakers game will be a little more impactful than you think. The first trade that happened for the Utah Jazz was between Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills going to the Clippers for PJ Tucker, Mo Bamba, and a 2030 second round pick, along with some cash consideration. Mo Bamba didn't last very long on the roster as he was traded to make room for some other additions after arguably the largest trade in NBA history, which Utah, they were involved, but you're not going to remember that they were a part of it because the LA Lakers got Luka Doncic, Maxi Kleber, and Markieff Morris. Dallas received Anthony Davis, Max Christie, and a 2029 first round pick, while Utah, they took some money off the books for these teams as they paid them $55,000 each to receive Jalen Hood Shafino and 2 second round picks. It's a very large trade, and with Utah facing the Lakers on the road on February 10th, Luka Doncic is currently slated to be back and healthy playing on February 8th, but they might take a little extra precaution and wait till the 10th. The Utah Jazz, they'll actually be playing the Lakers at home on February 12th. So for you fans here in Salt Lake City, you'll be able to see Luka Doncic in action as long as nothing happens to him on 12th. But according to some sources, Utah is not done dealing. Chicago has been one of the names that I personally have heard trickle around with potentially sending off newly acquired guard Trey Jones out here to Salt Lake City. I personally am a big fan of Trey Jones. That's who I would like to see in this trade. But again, they did mention that it would be one of their newly acquired pieces. So that means it could also be Zach Collins or Kevin Herter as well. The trade season, it is crazy, and we'll have plenty to talk about with our next episode. But the deadline isn't until Thursday. So I'm sure that there will be plenty of movement for us to talk about on the next episode of Being on the Scene. Now, for the Utah Hockey Club, this homestand has not gone according to plan. They started it off against the Pittsburgh Penguins on national television. It was Sidney Crosby's first time being at the Delta Center, so I'm sure that everybody was just super stoked about it. But, it was really hard for Utah fans to really watch this one. Uh, Even though Sergachev was able to get scoring started on the power play in the first period, you got to see his coined, overly excited celebration, which got the fans really into it early. But that excitement was derailed by Marcus Pettersson, who got a goal to tie things up. But then Michael Carcone, he got probably one of the luckiest goals I've ever witnessed in person, as he got the puck to hover over Alex Nedeljkovic. He got it right over his head and gave Utah the lead once again at 2-1. Now, 3/4 of the way in the final period, Erik Karlsson evened things up to score an unassisted goal, sending us into overtime at 2-2. Now, this is where Crosby showed why he's a future Hall of Famer, getting the game-winning goal with a minute left in overtime off a very tough angle as Pittsburgh walks out of the Delta Center with a 3-2 win. The next game that Utah had was against Columbus, as it was their first time traveling to Salt Lake City. Similar to Utah's previous game, the scoring started off on a power play, but this time it came in the second period, and it was thanks to Nick Schmaltz. The defensive battle looked to be going in Utah's favor after Alex Kerfoot scored just seconds into the third period, but the Blue Jackets came marching back. Kirill Marchenko and Kent Johnson both got goals in the third period, which would leave our final score in regulation at 2-2. So back-to-back games in overtime, but it didn't take long for overtime to end as Zach Werenski and Cole Sillinger, they were able to get a 2 on no one breakaway. So they were just passing the puck back and forth and were able to get the goal with ease, getting the 3-2 win over Utah. So now losing four straight, two of them in overtime, Utah is looking to get back on their feet against the St. Louis Blues on Sunday. Penalties galore in this one as both teams combined for a total of 24 penalty minutes. The Blues got the scoring started in the just before the first intermission as Alexander Tessier, we're going to butcher that name. I hope I didn't say it wrong, and if I did, my bad. He gave the Blues the 1-0 lead, and Utah was unable to respond until the third period with Michael Kesselring tying things up. But the Blues ruined Utah's chances in this game as Jordan Kyrou got a goal shortly after Kesselring, which gave us our final score of 2-1. So now with some injury news, Dylan Guenther, he is making his return tonight against the Philadelphia Flyers. Everyone's super excited for it because of his entrance into the lineup. Lawson Krause will be a healthy scratch for the night. Sean Dursey, he's still in a non-contact uniform at practice, but we did hear that we will receive a update on his injury after the Four Nations break, which will be starting next week. And then Logan Cooley, he was recently designated to IR after a lower body injury that he suffered this past week, which is really sad. He was really on a great run, but hopefully he'll be able to heal up and get back sooner rather than later. Now, trade news: Utah Hockey Club they did get involved with a trade. It's not blockbuster or anything like the Utah Jazz briefly did, but they made a trade with the Minnesota Wild for Sammy Walker. Hasn't really had much NHL time, but I would expect him to go to the Tucson Roadrunners, spend some time in the AHL, and that would end up promoting someone, say, like Kyler Yamamoto. I think that it would be worth the promotion given his recent production. But, we'll see what the organization has in mind. But for Utah's upcoming games, they have one tonight, as I mentioned earlier, with Dylan Guenther. Tonight, Tuesday, February 4th, they will be facing the Philadelphia Flyers at home, which will be their last home game before the Four Nations break. And then they will go on the road Thursday, February 6th at Columbus. Then Saturday, February 8th at Carolina. And then that will be the first game of a back-to-back, where on Sunday, February 9th, they will be at Washington. And then that will lead them into the Four Nations break. Now, that was a very short and sweet being on the scene. Just had to rush it all out there because there was a lot of information. But we will see what happens with there being the Four Nations break and the All-Star break right around the corner. I should anticipate having some guests to fill the void, but we will figure that out when we cross that road. But with that being said, that is another episode of Being on the Scene. I am Alma Bean, and you enjoy the rest of your day.